Right after the vows, instead of lifting me into his arms, my husband did something no one expected. He picked up his mother, leaving me standing alone at the altar. What I did next left the entire room frozen in shock. I was standing at the altar when my groom carried his mother down the aisle. Not a figure of speech, not a metaphor for anything. Luis Valdez physically lifted Elena Valdez, his 63-year-old mother in her cream Chanel suit and pearl earrings, cradled her like a bride, and walked her down the marble aisle of St. Augustine's Cathedral, while 400 guests watched in complete, suffocating silence. I was holding white peonies. My hands were completely still. That's the part people don't believe when I tell them. They expect me to say my hands were shaking, that I was falling apart, that tears were cutting through my makeup, but my hands were perfectly, unnaturally still, because I had known this was coming for 3 weeks. I had prepared for it. I had spent 3 weeks turning grief into architecture, building something out of the rubble of a love I thought was real. So while 400 people held their breath and Elena smiled that slow, satisfied smile, the smile of a woman who had spent 30 years building a kingdom and was now watching it bow to her, I stood there in $4,000 worth of Italian lace, and I waited. I had one thing left to do, and I was going to do it perfectly. I need to take you back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning isn't Luis, or Elena, or the Valdez family money. The beginning is my father. Aurelio Reyes was a family lawyer for 31 years. He had the kind of practice that didn't advertise, the kind that runs on handshakes and confidentiality agreements, and the quiet understanding that the people who hired him were not people you discussed in casual conversation. He was thin, precise, obsessively organized, and he smelled like cedar and black coffee. He died 26 months ago of pancreatic cancer, and he did it the way he did everything else, efficiently, without complaint, and with his affairs impeccably in order. His most important client for the last 3 decades of his life was Ricardo Valdez. I grew up knowing the Valdez name the way you know a weather pattern. It was always in the background of our house somewhere. My father would take calls on Sunday mornings that made him walk to the other end of the yard. There were documents I was never supposed to see. There was a locked drawer in his mahogany desk that I didn't even try to open until I was well into my 20s. The Valdez account was the reason we had a good house in a good neighborhood, the reason my college tuition was handled without drama. I understood that without ever being told directly. I met Luis Valdez at a charity gala when I was 28. He was 31. He was funny in a self-deprecating way that felt rare for a man with that much money, and he had his father's eyes, Ricardo's eyes, calm and quietly sad, like a man who had already made peace with things he couldn't change. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. I said yes in a garden in Seville while the light was going gold, and I genuinely believed, in the marrow of my bones, that I had found something real. My father had been gone for 4 months by then. He never got to meet Luis properly. They shook hands once at a dinner, and my father said afterward quietly, "He's a good man, Karen. The question is whether he knows it yet." I didn't know what that meant at the time. I know now. The prenuptial agreement appeared on Luis's home office desk on a Thursday. I wasn't snooping. I want to be very clear about that because it matters later when people start asking questions about my version of events. I was bringing Luis a coffee because he'd been in that office since 7 in the morning, and it was past noon and he hadn't eaten. The document was just sitting there, open, center of the desk. I set the coffee down. I read the first page. Standard language, asset disclosure, definitions of marital property. My eyes moved out of habit, the kind of habit you develop when your father is a lawyer and you grow up watching him annotate documents at the dinner table. Page 3 stopped me cold. The party of the second part, Karen Reyes, hereinafter referred to as wife, forfeits all marital assets and any claim to Valdez family holdings in the event that wife opposes, undermines, publicly contradicts, or fails to demonstrate appropriate deference to Mrs. Elena Valdez in any matter, personal, financial, or social, as determined at Mrs. Elena Valdez's sole discretion. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, very slowly, like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something less grotesque. They didn't. I picked up the coffee I'd brought Luis and walked back to the kitchen. I poured it down the drain. I stood at the sink for a while looking at the garden. Then I went upstairs, opened my nightstand drawer, and took out the envelope my father had given me 8 months before he died. He'd pressed it into my hands on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been visiting him at the house. He was still mobile then, still sharp, though the weight loss had started and we both knew what it meant. He'd come out of his study with this small white envelope, letter-sized, sealed with tape, and initialed across the seal in his handwriting. A.R. Aurelio Reyes. "I need you to keep this somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere only you know." "Dad, what is this?" "It's an insurance policy," he said, "for a situation I hope never happens. But if it does," he stopped, looked at me with those careful lawyer's eyes. "You'll know when, and you'll know what to do with it. Trust yourself." I asked him 3 more times over the following months what was in it. He deflected every time, gently but completely. When he died, it went with me to my apartment, into the nightstand, under a library book and a spare phone charger, and I mostly forgot it existed, until that Thursday in Luis's office. I brought the envelope downstairs to the kitchen. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a Thursday afternoon and I opened it. Inside was a single folded document, 8 pages, hand notarized on every page. At the top, last will and testament of Ricardo Emilio Valdez. Original executed document, sealed copy held in trust with Aurelio Reyes, ESQ. I turned to page 6. There was a clause. Section 14 14, subsection C. My father had marked it with a small penciled asterisk in the margin, the only mark on an otherwise pristine document. I read it once and my coffee went cold. The rational thing, the thing a normal, trusting person would have done, was to confront Luis directly. And for about 48 hours, I tried to be that person. I told myself the prenup clause was Elena's doing, not Luis's. I told myself Luis hadn't read it carefully, that he would be horrified when I showed him, that we'd laugh about it later. I rehearsed the conversation 4 times in my head, adjusting the tone, keeping it calm and non-accusatory. I never had it, because on Saturday morning, 2 days after I found the document, I came downstairs early and heard Luis on the phone in the kitchen. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I wasn't trying to listen. But the house was quiet and his voice was carrying, and I heard him say clearly without hesitation, "She'll do it, Mom. She'll be embarrassed in the moment, but she'll understand afterward. She always goes along eventually." The stair creaked under my foot. Luis turned around, saw me. We looked at each other for a long moment. He said, "Karen?" And I shook my head once and walked back upstairs. She always goes along eventually. I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about my father, about the way he'd said "you'll know when," about the way he'd known Ricardo Valdez for 30 years, known the family, known what Elena was capable of, and had still somehow trusted me with the one piece of paper that could unravel it all. My hands weren't shaking. That's when I knew I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to cancel the wedding. I wasn't going to confront Luis or give Elena the satisfaction of watching me break apart before the ceremony even happened. I was going to go through with it, and I was going to finish it. I made 3 phone calls that Sunday. The first was to Dr. Paloma Whitfield, a family law attorney I'd consulted twice before on unrelated matters. She was 52, 20 years of practice, the kind of lawyer who didn't raise her voice because she never needed to. I described the prenuptial clause without naming names. She listened without interrupting, then said, "That clause is likely unenforceable under state law, but that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is the environment it implies. Don't sign anything, and bring me everything you have before any ceremony." I told her about the sealed will. A pause. Then, "Don't let that document out of your possession. Get it scanned, upload it to cloud storage you control, and give me the originals when you're ready." Karen. Another pause. This is significant. The second call was to Father Benedetto at St. Augustine's. I'd known him since I was 17. He'd performed my confirmation, attended my father's funeral, and was one of the few people in my life who had no connection to the Valdez family. I asked him if, hypothetically, a person had something important to say at a wedding ceremony. Would there be a microphone at the altar? He told me there was always a microphone at the altar. "Good," I said. "Karen," his voice was careful. "Are you all right?" "I'm going to be," I said. "I promise." The third call was to Dr. Emilio Ibarra, who had been Ricardo Valdez's personal physician and a close friend of my father's. Retired now, 71 years old, with the bearing of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. I asked him if he remembered, clearly, the circumstances around Ricardo's death and the reading of Ricardo's will. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father called me the week before Ricardo died. He told me to remember the date. He said there might come a time when someone needed a witness who wasn't on Elena's payroll. Would you come to my wedding?" I asked. Another pause. "Tell me when," he said. "The week before the ceremony, I did 3 things that nobody knew about. I scanned every page of Ricardo's original will and uploaded it to a private encrypted drive. I sent Dr. Paloma Whitfield the originals in a sealed courier envelope with a single-page summary of what I intended to do. She called me back within 2 hours and spent 45 minutes trying to talk me out of the public venue and into a court filing. I listened to every argument she made. Then I told her politely that I had thought about it carefully and that a court filing would give Elena 6 months to maneuver, 6 months to disappear assets, 6 months to pressure Luis and intimidate witnesses. A public venue would give her 6 seconds. "You understand this will be chaotic," Dr. Whitfield said. "My father spent 30 years protecting this document in secret," I said. "I think it deserves to see the light in public." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll be in the 3rd pew," she said finally, "on the left." The second thing I did was call Dr. Vargas. Rodrigo Vargas had been the Valdez family's estate lawyer for 12 years. He was 60 years old, Harvard-trained, and deeply, visibly uncomfortable whenever Elena was in the room. I had noticed this at every family dinner for 2 years without fully understanding it. I called him from a payphone near my office, which felt slightly absurd, but I was beyond caring about absurdity at that point. I told him I had the original Ricardo Valdez will, that it superseded the version on file, and that I would be presenting it publicly at my wedding ceremony. I gave him the address of the courier service, where I'd stored a copy in escrow with a notary. He didn't say anything for so long that I thought the call had dropped. "I've been waiting 12 years for someone to do this," he finally said. The third thing I did was put a copy of the document in a small envelope and tape it to the inside of my wedding dress, flat against my ribs, under the boning of the bodice. It pressed against my skin every time I breathed. I spent the entire morning of my wedding feeling it there, a thin edge of paper against my sternum, and every time I felt it, I thought about my father walking to the end of the yard to take Sunday phone calls, keeping someone else's secrets so carefully for so long that he'd turned them into my inheritance. The morning of the wedding, Elena's assistant sent me a text at 7:14 a.m. that read, "Mrs. Valdez wants to confirm you've reviewed and signed the prenuptial agreement. Please confirm before noon." I screenshot it, emailed it to Dr. Whitfield. Then I got my hair done. I'll tell you what it's like to stand at an altar knowing what's coming, because I've never seen anyone describe it accurately. It's not calm exactly. Calm implies the absence of feeling. What I felt was more like density, like everything had compressed down into a single point of focus, and I was moving through the world in slow motion, completely clear. I watched Luis take his place at the altar. I watched Elena Valdez take her seat in the front row in her cream Chanel suit. I watched Dr. Whitfield settle into the third pew on the left, her briefcase beside her. I watched Dr. Ibarra take his place near the back, upright and still. Dr. Vargas was outside, in the car, waiting for a phone call that I had told him would come. I walked down the aisle on the arm of my uncle Bernardo, who had no idea what was about to happen, and was smiling the uncomplicated smile of a man who thought he was delivering his niece to a beautiful future. I smiled back at him. I meant it, actually. I was grateful he was there. I squeezed his arm. The ceremony began. Father Benedetto's voice was steady and warm, the same voice I had known for 20 years. The cathedral smelled like candle wax and lilies. The light through the stained glass was extraordinary, these great falling columns of red and gold, and I stood in it and thought about how my father would have loved this room. We were 6 minutes in when Elena stood up. She didn't wait for a cue, didn't wait for the traditional moment. She simply stood, and Luis who I had loved, Luis with his father's quiet, sad eyes, turned to look at her with an expression I can only describe as relief, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. He walked to his mother. She opened her arms, and Luis Valdez, my groom, my fiancé of 2 years, lifted his 63-year-old mother and carried her down the marble aisle of St. Augustine's Cathedral like she was the one getting married. She smiled the entire way, not at the guests, not at Luis, at me. I watched her come. My hands were perfectly still. Luis set Elena down gently at the front. She kissed his cheek. He turned to me with that awkward, apologetic smile, the smile of a man who genuinely believed I would swallow this, rearrange my expression into something gracious, and proceed. And he reached out his hand. I looked at his hand. Then I reached up and removed my veil. I let it fall. The sound it made was almost nothing, a whisper of fabric on marble. But in that silence, with 400 people who had stopped breathing, it might as well have been a gunshot. I walked to the microphone. Here is what I've been asked about most in the months since. Was I scared? Did my voice shake? Did some part of me hesitate? No, and no. Because the moment I stepped to that microphone, I wasn't just myself anymore. I was my father, who had kept a secret for 30 years, so I could stand in this cathedral and say it out loud. I was Ricardo Valdez, a man I'd barely known, who had loved my father enough to trust him with the one true document of his wishes, because he knew his own wife would bury it. I was every person in that room who had watched Elena operate for decades and said nothing because they needed something from her. I was the last stop on a very long road. Friends and family, I said, and my voice was perfectly level. Today was supposed to be the beginning of my life with the man I loved. Luis said, "Karen, please," very quietly. I didn't look at him. What you just witnessed wasn't a tradition, it wasn't affection, it was a performance, agreed upon in advance, required to satisfy the conditions of a financial inheritance. The humiliation you watched was choreographed. I was supposed to accept it. The room erupted into the sound of 400 people breathing at once. A low collective noise, like something shifting. Elena shot to her feet. "This is obscene. She is a gold digger and a liar, and she is trying to destroy this family." "Sit down," I said. Not loud, not aggressive, just final. Elena didn't sit, but she stopped talking. The whole cathedral watched her not talk, and I think that's the moment they understood what they were actually looking at. Luis was required to publicly demonstrate loyalty to his mother, Elena Valdez, over his wife in a humiliating and public manner in order to receive the Valdez family inheritance. This was not a rumor. This was written into a prenuptial agreement I was expected to sign. Somewhere in the room I heard someone say what, and someone else say, "Oh my God," and behind me I heard Luis say, "Karen, you don't have the full picture." "I have the complete picture," I said. "I've had it for 3 weeks." I reached into the bodice of my dress and removed the envelope. There's a photograph from this moment. I've seen it. I look completely steady, this flat envelope held up in the light from the stained glass, white against the red and gold. I've been told it looks staged. It wasn't. That's just what certainty looks like when you've had 3 weeks to find it. This is the original last will and testament of Ricardo Emilio Valdez, not the version that was presented to his estate lawyer after his death, not the version that has governed the Valdez family finances for the past 14 years. The original, held in sealed trust by my father, Aurelio Reyes, Ricardo's personal attorney, for the duration of his life, and then passed to me. The sound from Elena was not a word. It was something more primitive than a word. Her hand shot out and grabbed the back of the nearest pew, and her knuckles went white, and I watched the blood leave her face in real time. Luis had gone completely still. His face was a color I didn't have a word for. My father knew what Elena Valdez was capable of, I continued. Ricardo knew what Elena was capable of. He built a clause into his original will because he was not willing to leave his son at her mercy forever. He left a door open. He gave the key to the one person he trusted completely. What clause? Luis's voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at him. The last time I would look at him the way I'd been looking at him for 2 years, like he was someone I understood. If on his wedding day, Luis Valdez demonstrates preference for financial gain or family coercion over genuine love, demonstrates it publicly, demonstrably, beyond reasonable interpretation, the Valdez mansion transfers immediately to a children's charitable foundation of Ricardo's designation. The dreams Dreams of Tomorrow Foundation. Ricardo's words, Ricardo's wishes. The cathedral did not explode exactly. What it did was shatter, all at once, in every direction. People on their feet, voices overlapping. Elena screaming something that I couldn't make out because Father Benedetto had stepped to the side microphone and was asking for calm in the voice he used when things were genuinely out of control. 2 security guards moved toward the front. I watched the guests near the aisle simply close ranks without organizing it, bodies filling the space, not threatening, just present. 400 people collectively deciding that this was not going to be stopped. My phone buzzed in my bouquet. One message from Dr. Whitfield. Vargas is at the door. Rodrigo Vargas walked into St. Augustine's Cathedral in a gray suit with the measured pace of a man who had waited 12 years for this particular afternoon. He came down the center aisle. Someone passed him the envelopes. He stood at the side of the altar, opened the document, and read it with the careful, thorough attention of a man who had been trained to read documents exactly this way and had no interest in being wrong. He looked up. 400 people looked at him. The clause is valid, Dr. Vargas said. His voice was clear and completely steady. The original will supersedes the amended version on file. The Valdez mansion transfers to the Dreams of Tomorrow Foundation, effective immediately, pursuant to the witnessed events of this ceremony. Luis crumpled. That's the only word for it. He didn't fall. He caught himself on the altar with one hand, but everything in him seemed to come loose at once. Karen, his voice broke in a way that might have destroyed me 3 weeks ago. I love you. I was weak. I was stupid. I let her control me my whole life. I know that. I know it. Please, just give me one more chance to prove it. Please. I looked at him for a long moment. The man with his father's eyes. The man who had looked at me across a garden in Seville when the light was going gold and made me believe in something. You don't love me, I said. You love what money feels like. You love what approval feels like. If you loved me, I paused. Let it land. You would have carried me. I walked to the altar. I placed my engagement ring on the marble step beside my fallen veil. The diamond caught the light from the stained glass, all that red and gold, and threw small, bright pieces of it across the stone floor. Then I turned around and walked down the aisle. They told me afterward that the guests parted for me without coordinating it, that it happened instinctively, people stepping back, clearing a path, facing me as I passed. Dr. Oy. Ibarra was near the back, and he nodded once as I passed him. Not dramatically, just the small nod of an old man acknowledging something completed, and I nodded back. I walked out of St. Augustine's Cathedral into bright afternoon light, and I did not look back. My uncle Bernardo was waiting on the steps. He had slipped out early and stood there with his car keys and an expression that was trying very hard to be calm. Where do you need to go? He asked. Anywhere, I said. Somewhere quiet. He drove me to a small restaurant near the water that was mostly empty at that hour on a Saturday. We sat at a corner table. He ordered coffee for both of us without asking. For a while, we didn't say anything. Then he said, "Your father knew, didn't he?" It wasn't really a question. He knew enough to prepare, I said. Bernardo wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked out at the water. He was always the smartest man in any room he was in, he said quietly. He just never made people feel that way. I thought about that for a long time. Here's what happened in the weeks after. Dr. Paloma Whitfield filed the formal documentation to transfer the Valdez mansion to the Dreams of Tomorrow Foundation, 7 days after the ceremony. Elena's attorneys filed an injunction within 48 hours. The injunction was denied. A second filing was denied. A third filing, based on a procedural challenge to the notarization of the original will, took 6 weeks to resolve and was denied in full. Dr. Rodrigo Vargas provided a sworn deposition describing the discrepancies between the original will and the amended version that had been filed after Ricardo's death. The amended version, according to his testimony, had been submitted to the estate with a notarization dated 3 days after Ricardo died. A notarization that could not, by definition, have been executed during Ricardo's lifetime. The word fraud appeared in 3 separate legal documents before anyone in the press used it publicly. Dr. Ende. Ibarra provided a statement confirming the timeline of Ricardo's final weeks, including a record of a conversation Ricardo had specifically requested be documented, in which Ricardo expressed his awareness that Elena intended to challenge his testamentary wishes and his confidence that his attorney Aurelio Reyes held sufficient documentation to prevent it. My father had known. He had known for years, and he had kept the document, and he had given it to me because he trusted me to know when. The mansion transferred to the Dreams of Tomorrow Foundation on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after my wedding day. I read about it in a brief legal notice that Dr. Whitfield forwarded to me with a single line of commentary. Your father would be proud. I sat with that for a while. I don't know what Luis is doing now. I've heard things through the ambient noise of mutual acquaintances, that he's living in a rental in the north part of the city, that he and Elena have stopped speaking, that he's been in therapy. I hope the last part is true. I hope he figures out at some point who he is when she's not in the room. I hope he finds out it's better than he thought. I don't hate Luis. I want to be clear about that because people always seem surprised when I say it. What Luis did was a failure. It was a real significant failure that cost him something irreplaceable. But Elena built that failure in him over 30 years, brick by brick, until the man who could have been his father became someone who carried his mother down the aisle at his own wedding. That's not nothing. That's a full, elaborate tragedy that started long before I entered the story. What I know is this: I am not someone who goes along eventually. My father knew that before I did. 6 months after the wedding, I went back to my parents' house to help my mother sort through the last of my father's office. His mahogany desk, the files. The locked drawer that I finally opened to find, entirely anticlimactically, a collection of birthday cards I'd made him as a child, and a photograph of the two of us at my law school graduation, him with his arm around me, both of us squinting into the sun. I sat down on the floor of his office and held that photograph for a long time. He looked so certain of me. Even then, before any of this, before Luis or the Valdez family or the sealed envelope, he was looking at me like he already knew. You'll know when. Trust yourself. I did, Dad. I did.